Good morning, everyone. My name is Julien Lafortune, and I'm a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you for tuning into our program today, featuring the findings of our new report, Targeted K-12 Funding and Student Outcomes. We would like to thank our funders, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Stewart Foundation, for their generous support of this research and today's event. The report, as well as the slides from today's presentation, are available on our website, ppic.org. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. For today's program, I will present some key findings from the report, and then I will answer questions from the audience. If you have a question about the report, please send an email to the address listed on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We would appreciate you including your name and organization along with your question. And with that, I will begin the presentation. So this report is titled Targeted K-12 Funding and Student Outcomes, Evaluating the Local Control Funding Formula. And in it, we examine how the additional funding has been used under LCFF, how districts appear to be targeting funding to school sites, and whether we can detect any meaningful improvements in student outcomes since the inception of LCFF. This is ultimately the goal of any school funding policy. Again, we graciously appreciate the support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Stewart Foundation, and I also wish to thank Radhika Malhotra for outstanding research support on this project. So before getting into any specifics about the findings from the report, I think it's helpful to first talk in general about what the LCFF, or the Local Control Funding Formula, exactly changed about school funding in California. And in general, the LCFF brought about two major reforms to school finance in California. First, it introduced what is often called a weighted funding formula, which gives additional funding to school districts that serve more high-need students. Under LCFF, high need is defined as students who are low income, English learners, and/or foster youth. And second, the LCFF also eliminated a large number of categorical funding streams, giving more local control of districts over how they spend this additional funding and their base funding. So in other words, LCFF is about one, additional funding for high-need students, and two, additional flexibility in how to deploy that funding. Now, LCFF is now in its 9th year and has been fully funded since the 2018-19 school year. In this report, we examine the first 8 years of LCFF, just up to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in particular, we're interested in the financial effects. So we'll be focused more on the funding formula and the financial changes than the increase in local control over spending per se, although that's still an important area for LCFF. Now, a bit more background on the funding formula itself. There are three main components. The first is called a base grant, and this is in per student terms. And this is the base level of funding that each district gets per student or per unit of average daily attendance. And you could think of this as being generally equivalent, although it does vary based on the grade level and a few other characteristics. Second, there's what's called the supplemental grant, and this is the first component of the weighted funding formula. This increases the base grant a district gets by 20% for each high need student. So in other words, districts get an additional 20% funding times the share of high need that they have. And I'll explain this in more detail in the next slide. The next component of the funding formula is the concentration grant. And here, this gives an additional 50% on top of the base grant for each high need student, but crucially, each high need student above the 55% threshold. So this only applies to those districts that have 55% or more high need students. And note that this increased from 50 to 65% as a part of the 2021-22 budget. But in this report, we'll be looking prior to those years, and so we'll be focused on the 50% size of the concentration grant. So in many ways, it's easier to see what this means by looking at a figure. And so here we have a figure that shows on the vertical axis, the percentage increase in funding over the base grant, and on the horizontal axis, the share high need or the unduplicated pupil percentage at the district level. And this is sometimes referred to as the LCFF hockey stick graph, as it shows the increase districts get in funding based on their share of high need, and then shows the kink in that increase at the 55% cutoff. And so you can see going from 0 to 55%, districts just receive the supplemental grant, and then above 55%, they receive the concentration grant. That's the solid teal line. And then the dashed orange line is the new concentration grant that's been increased in the most recent year from 50 to 65%. And just to get an example of what this means for a couple, say, hypothetical districts, say a district has 25% high need students, then they would get 5% additional funding. A district that has 50% high need students would get 10% additional funding. A district that has 75% high need students would now get concentration grant funding in addition, so they would get 25% additional funding. And say a district has 100% or serves all high need students, they would get just over 42% additional funding. And that goes up to almost 50% additional funding with the new concentration grant. So now that we've covered some of the LCFF background, I think it's worth getting into the specific aims of this report and our specific research questions. And so first, and most importantly, how has LCFF affected resource levels for schools and districts of varying need? Second, how has this increased funding, or has this increased funding led to improved student outcomes, and specifically in those districts targeted by the formula? And then third, is LCFF funding reaching the schools and students with the highest need within districts? In other words, are districts targeting funds to the students and school sites within their district consistent with the intent of LCFF? Now, to the first question, we can see the impact of LCFF by looking at how much spending has increased in different districts since the year before LCFF was enacted. And so here on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, this shows the total dollars in per student terms that are spent. And this is and we can see this both in 2012-13 and in 2019-20. And this is in inflation adjusted 2020 dollars. So the left two columns show what's considered or often called student spending or K-12 student spending, whereas the right two columns show non-K-12 student spending. And what we mean by this is K-12 student spending is essentially spending minus categories that aren't as germane to the current experiences that students are experiencing in the classroom. So this excludes things like capital outlay, debt service, adult education, and pre-K expenditures. And what we can see when we look at this is that one, spending increased in districts of all levels of need from 2012-13 to 2019-20, but two, spending increased faster in districts that are the highest need. So the gap between districts, or the difference in spending between districts that are the lowest, those in the orange bar from 0 to 30% unduplicated pupil percentage, and those that are the highest, 80% or higher high need, that was around $1,300 per student in 2012-13, and now the highest need districts spend about $2,700 per student more in K-12 student spending than they did prior to LCFF. So that relative change is the impact of LCFF. The overall increase across all districts is really a function of coming out of the depths of the Great Recession and the recovery in spending and the state economy overall. Now, another thing that's important to point out, and there's less of a focus of this report, we can see that while K-12 student spending has increased consistent with the formula, more so in the highest need districts, that hasn't been the case for non-K-12 student spending, and that's largely driven by inequities in capital spending, or the fact that a lot of capital outlay tends to be locally funded and relies on district property wealth to generate these funds. And so how has this spending been targeted just in terms of categories at the district level? And so here we're not showing the overall level of spending, but we're showing the change between 2012-13 and 2019-20. And so here we can see basically what has the increase been across all these districts of varying levels of need since the inception of LCFF. And so first we can see that there have been relatively small increases in administrative salaries. This isn't surprising. It's one of the smaller categories of spending. And then the big increases in spending have really come through teacher salaries, materials, services, and kind of other pupil services, and then most importantly, staff benefits. And if you kind of look at the relative differences, so where are the relatively larger increases among those highest versus the lowest need districts, you can see a lot of that is showing up in these kind of materials and services, in pupil services and support staff, and as well as staff benefits. And so staff benefit costs have gone up for all districts, and they've gone up more so in the districts that have the highest need students. And why is that? Well, first of all, these benefit costs increased across all districts because generally of increases in health costs, and also because of increases in district contribution rates for pension plans. But they've increased more so in the highest need districts because some of these benefit costs are fixed per employee, And a lot of the highest need districts have been hiring more staff or had higher staffing levels to begin with. And so that's where some of that money is going. It's important to think of this still as compensation for staff, which is the major input in any school setting. So now that we've covered this funding increase, and there's more detail on this in the report, how do we know whether this extra funding and spending is really working to improve outcomes? And so we can look at trends in test scores in graduation, in A through G completion, and we see that we've experienced larger increases in the highest need districts and commensurately reductions in gaps. But importantly, this may or may not be due to LCFF, so we need a more careful comparison, right? There have been a lot of other things that have changed over the past 7 years. And so to actually assess the impact of the funding formula, we'll use a different design or a different strategy in this report. And what we do is we're motivated by the fact that, if you remember that hockey stick graph, the formula has a kink in the amount of funding at the 55% threshold. So then we ask, given that kink, does the relationship between the share high need and student outcomes, not of funding, does that become more kinked over time? And importantly, this kind of nets out any other effects that are changing that may affect this relationship, because none of them would be discontinuous at the 55% threshold. The only thing that's changing discontinuously or changing discretely at this threshold is the fact that the slope of funding increases more. And so let's see first what this looks like prior to LCFF. And so if we look in 2012, and this is on the California Standardized Test, the CST, we see that there's really no change in the slope of this relationship between student outcomes and test score, or student outcomes and the district share high need in 2012-13. And so what is this figure showing exactly? Each dot here is comprised of multiple districts. So it's not showing all districts, it's showing the average across districts with similar shares of high need students. And so on the very left, those dots there are essentially, they are showing you that a little over 80% of students in districts that have low shares of high need students, around say 15 or 20%, are meeting or exceeding grade level standards. And then you see that there's a strong downward relationship there. And again, why is there a downward relationship? Well, we already know this from a lot of settings. There's simply a powerful relationship between socioeconomic status and test scores, and this shows up in a multitude of ways that we can look at this in the data. But the important thing to note is that there's nothing discontinuously changing about this relationship at the 55% threshold, which is shown as the dotted vertical line here in gray. And then if you look very closely, you can see that there's actually a dotted blue line, and that's essentially what the slope would be if the slope above the 55% threshold, or in districts with fewer than 55% high need, what that slope would be if it continues. And really, it's not different than the slope that we actually observe. However, when we look at the most recent test scores in 2018-19, we see evidence that there's actually a bit of a kink, or that this relationship is bending across that 55% threshold. So here, there's still a strong downward relationship between share high need and the share meeting standards. That is to say that as we increase the district share high need, we have fewer and fewer students meeting or exceeding grade level standards. But now we see that that relationship is actually somewhat kinked. The slope bends at 55%. And that's consistent with the impact of the concentration grant having a positive impact on test scores. We know that the funding formula is kinked there. We're providing additional funding, especially so for those very high need districts above 80%. And so if that funding is having a productive effect, we would expect this relationship between student outcomes and district share high need to become more kinked as well. And so in the big picture, when we estimate this in the report, and we do this more formally than just kind of the visualizations that I showed, we find that roughly $1,000 per year in additional concentration grant funding has led to a 5 percentage point rise in the share meeting or exceeding standards. And so if we want to extrapolate that and assume effects are continuing at the same pace, given a gap between high and lower need districts of about $2,000 per year in extra funding and extra spending that LCFF is providing, that implies that this concentration grant funding could potentially close test score gaps between these highest and lowest need districts in around 14 years. Now, of course, these are notable improvements, 5 percentage points for $1,000 per year over time, but these gaps are also large. And so that's part of the reason why these estimates suggest that this, even though those improvements are notable, it might take a long time. And then the second thing to note is that this was estimated pre-COVID. And we know that we have a lot of evidence, and then there's a lot of, both in the test score data and from our experiences that there's many reasons to suspect that disparities grew during the pandemic. And so in many ways, this may take even longer if we're just relying on the financial impacts of LCFF because of the fact that disparities have grown during the pandemic. Another thing that we find, and I don't go into detail here, but you can check it out in the report, is that concentration grants also look to have improved A through G completion. And so we see larger increases in A through G completion in concentration districts than we do in non-concentration districts. And that kind of relative difference started around the time of LCFF and grew over time, consistent with the positive impact of the funding formula. So overall, when we look at the student outcomes, we see benefits at the district level. Districts that are receiving more funding, in particular districts that are receiving the most concentration grant funding, are seeing benefits in terms of test scores and also potentially A through G completion. But when we look at the student level, we actually see smaller improvements in test score gaps or achievement gaps and disparities by income or by race. And so why is that? Why can we see what look to be fairly appreciable improvements in student outcomes at the district level, but we don't really see these when looking at achievement gaps at the student level? And so really there's two reasons for this, and I'll walk through both of these. And first, that's because LCFF, as you remember based on the formula, targets the highest need districts, but high need students are dispersed across districts throughout the state. So they're not all in these highest need districts that have 80% or more high need that get the majority of the funding under LCFF. And then the second is that districts control how they distribute funding. We don't really have a good sense, and there's no true monitoring system to tell us whether districts are spending money on their highest need students or whether they're getting these LCFF increases and, say, spending more generally on things that affect all students across the district. And the extent to which they do that, the extent to which they target that funding, has an impact on the efficacy of LCFF to reduce these gaps. And so I'll talk about the first point and display a little bit of data that informs this first point. And so this table here, again, is showing districts. So the four columns are districts with 0 to 30, 30 to 55, 55 to 80, and 80% or more high need. And then the first row is showing you the number of schools, and then the average share of schools that are concentration, or schools that have 55% or more high need, schools that have concentrated need. And then the last two rows, and these are really what I want you to focus on, are the share of the state's concentration schools in those types of districts, and then the share of the state's high need students in those types of districts. And so the first thing to notice is that the vast majority of high need students are in concentration districts, but there are still a lot of high need students, roughly 1 out of 5, or almost 20%, that are in districts that don't receive concentration funding, that have shares of high need under 55%. At the same time, while most concentration schools are in these high need districts, many are not. 12% of the state's concentration schools are in districts that don't receive concentration funding. And actually, if we look specifically at those districts of more moderate need, say from 30 to 55%, over 20% of those schools in those districts are actually what we would consider to be schools with concentrated need or poverty. And so that's the first part about targeting, and that's really about how schools and students are and how the formula targets students and schools based on the districts that it chooses to give money to. The second part about targeting, and the one that's been potentially most contentious around LCFF, is how districts actually target funding within the district to the students and schools that exist within it. And unfortunately, we don't have good data to really systematically assess this over time. District financial reports don't provide the level of detail that would be required, and LCAPs, or local control accountability plans, haven't, at least to date, provided or proved useful in tracking these dollars in a general sense. What we can do, however, is rely on recently released federal data from the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, that requires districts to provide site-level spending to the federal government. And importantly, we only have 1 year of these data. It starts in 2018-19, but this can give us a measure or a sense of how districts are targeting across school sites. And while it doesn't provide a direct measure of supplemental and concentration dollars themselves, we can use these data to ask the question, and this is what we do. For example, for each additional dollar in supplemental and concentration funding generated by students at a school site, how much does school site spending increase? And so crucially, this is, again, a partial measure. It's only 1 year, and we're only looking at the site level spending, which is about 2/3 of overall per pupil spending. Another third of spending is deemed by districts to be central spending, and that's equal and not tracked across school sites. And so when we estimate this, what do we see? Well, first and foremost, we see that by district, targeting varies considerably. And so I'll start with the overall average effect. That's the kind of top left column here in this table. And we see an estimate of 0.55 or 55 cents. So what does that mean? That means on average, for every additional dollar that the high need students at a school site generate in LCFF, supplemental, and concentration funding, we observe 55 cents higher spending at that specific school site. Now that implies that LCFF dollars are mostly, but not completely, targeted to the school sites where they're generated. We see a higher degree of targeting, nearly dollar per dollar in non-concentration districts, 93 cents out of the dollar, but we see less targeting in concentration districts. So concentration districts are spending more evenly, but perhaps that's not surprising because most of their students are high need. Now, the notable thing to notice, and you can see this looking at the percentiles and the medians below, is that this relationship actually varies a lot across districts. And so there's a substantial number of districts, over a quarter, that actually spend less on their highest need school sites than on their lowest need school sites. Whereas on the flip side, there's a substantial number of districts, about 30%, that spend more progressively than we'd expect under the LCFF formula, or spend more than dollar per dollar, given an increase due to the high need students at a site. So again, just to reiterate this point, we see big differences across districts in the extent of targeting. Some appear slightly regressive, while at the same time, many also appear to be more progressive perhaps than what LCFF would intend or what we might expect under LCFF. Now I'll mention, again, these data come with caveats. It's only a snapshot of 1 year, and it's not meant to specifically, look at districts in a very specific sense because we don't see the unique circumstances or the nuances in these data. So these aren't meant as an accountability metric or as a true transparency metric to evaluate LCFF itself. But when we look at the overall distribution or the average, it's still informative to tell us, roughly speaking, how much targeting is going on. And another important point, and I mentioned this, and I'll explain more on this, concentration districts actually showed more even spending. But perhaps we're less concerned about this. And so one thing you can think of is concentration districts, say concentration districts that have very high shares of high need students. Maybe the fact that they spend equally or similarly on schools of 80 and 90% high need, perhaps that's not as much of a policy problem, given the fact that almost all of the students at those school sites that are being targeted with additional funds are indeed high need themselves. So it's something to think about when we look at measures of targeting at districts that have predominantly, by and large, all high need students at their school sites. And so wrapping up, I'll finish with some policy implications and considerations. And so first, even though we have better data now under ESSA than we had at any point in years prior that allow us to get a more precise answer at the level of targeting that's happening, if we really want to understand, if we really want to be transparent about how districts are targeting these funds to students, we need more systematic and more intentional information to assess whether the spending is indeed consistent with LCFF's intent. Now, of course, site level transparency would be challenging. It would be, a significant cost to districts, but it's not something that's impossible, right? Many already do some form of this in their own budgeting, and they're also required to do this under the federal government guidelines in their ESSA reports as well. And second, the data show that a considerable share of the state's high need students are districts of more moderate need. Most of the state's high need students are actually in districts between 30 and 80% high need that didn't receive as much of an increase or haven't seen as much of a financial benefit in a relative sense compared to lower need districts under LCFF. So if we really want to attack gaps that are gaps among students at those types of districts, then we could consider lowering the threshold for concentration grants or perhaps increasing supplemental grants as well to better target those students. And then at the same time, there are a small minority of schools, but not an insignificant number of concentration schools in non-concentration districts that really aren't targeted well by the formula. And so it's worth considering alternative funding mechanisms, perhaps, to fund these types of school sites, these types of sites with high and concentrated need, commensurate with the level of need and poverty. So now we've reached the end of our presentation, and we'll move on to questions from the audience. And so we've already had some questions come in, but as a reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them to the email listed above, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and we'll begin answering them. And so the first question that came in is from Dawn in Sacramento, and it's asking, how can we make certain that the additional funding actually reaches low income, high poverty, high need, and outdated schools instead of going to those that have adequate, in theory, adequate funding and facilities? Well, that's a great question, and I think that really speaks to something I was getting at the end, that we could, if we really want to make sure, we'll need better financial accountability or transparency tools to really measure whether dollars are ending up at these school sites. And this is particularly important in districts that are highly segregated by student income. This isn't true in the high concentration districts, but a lot of those districts of more middle and need have schools that are very affluent and schools that are very low income within the same district. And so the extent to which districts are actually spending the money at those school sites, not those students who generate the additional funding, is something that we really can't measure without better kind of school site data. These exist under ESSA, but not to the level of granularity that we could really track it that we could track it for supplemental and concentration dollars specifically. Now, of course, LCAPs exist as well, but to date, these haven't proved useful as a comprehensive financial tool. But it's something that I think has been getting better over time. And as we look at that more, that may be also another useful way to track these dollars, especially for local stakeholders who aren't as interested in, say, the statewide view as what the operations actually are at their own specific district. And so we have a second question from Sacramento here. Should LCFF funding instead be based on concentration at the school site instead of the district to better target funding? And this is a tricky question. So I kind of alluded to this at the end. We have, not the large share, but it's not a small number either of concentration schools or schools that have concentrated poverty in districts that don't receive concentration grants and don't receive a lot of additional funding under LCFF. So in theory, we could fund based on concentration at the school site. If we're concerned, if our theory of action is that concentrated poverty or concentrated need is really something that's at the site level, the kind of motivation for that perhaps is a site level phenomenon rather than a district level one. The downside with that, and this is kind of what gives me pause, and I don't know that I've seen a good mechanism, to date that really could solve this, is the fact that I really am wary of any sort of metric or any sort of incentive that's created for districts to say, further segregate their schools. So if, for example, we give additional funding for districts with concentrated school sites or school sites with concentrated need, that creates a direct financial incentive for districts to shuffle around their students to perhaps have students be more segregated by income. Of course, that's not to say districts will actually do this or districts are bad actors, but we know that creating financial incentives for things that aren't desirable is just really not a good way of making policy. So one thing we could do is perhaps rely on, some sort of moving average or inspect districts or have some sort of process wherein if districts are becoming more segregated in their school sites, that, deserves a closer look. But that would also be kind of an increase in accountability as well, which is something that I think is a trade-off given, the opposition from, Sacramento-based policies kind of changing local operations. So there's definitely a trade-off there, but it's not an easy one. And so a third question here, and this is about achievement gaps. So given the fact that we've seen slow progress on achievement gaps, how much is LCFF really improving test scores? And I think here the nuance is LCFF is targeted to districts. And so when we look by districts, we see gaps improving faster, and we can measure, we can come up with more plausible, at least causal estimates that suggest that this additional funding is indeed improving student outcomes at the districts that receive the funding. But the thing is, districts are high need students or low income students or, whatever student group we're looking at these disparities across are not evenly or not perfectly clustered in the districts that receive the most funding. And so if districts aren't perfectly targeting funding, which we see that they're not, then we're going to see slower impact or slower improvements on student level. test score gaps, right? So the gap between, say, high and low income students specifically, than if we were to compare, say, high and low income districts. So we've got another question here from Carolyn in Los Angeles. What about high need schools, but Black students performing worse in achievement, and also related to English language learners? So I'm kind of interpreting this question to be about how the formula not just targets need based on income and also English language learner status, but also race as well. And so I have a little bit on this in the report, but there are a lot of, I think one of the great concerns is there are a lot of Black or African American students that aren't explicitly targeted under the formula. They may not, be English language learners. There may not be students that are deemed low income, and so there's no additional funding for them under the formula. When you look at it in the data, you see that on average, we've still seen larger increases in funding in the districts attended by Black students, but that's something that hasn't been as large as, say, for Hispanic students. So there is, something to that point if we wanted to target more explicitly by race. But more generally, it's also about, the question's also asking, what about students that are performing the worst in achievement, that are kind of at this lowest level of achievement? And I know we've had some policy interests that said, well, maybe the formula shouldn't be targeting student need based on kind of predefined categories. It should be targeting need by, how are students actually doing? Are they meeting grade level standards or not? And I think that's one way that we could target it, again, given the strong relationship between socioeconomic status and test score performance and race as well. The formula is kind of implicitly, albeit imperfectly, but implicitly targeting these categories. And there's some evidence on that in the report. But at the same time, when it comes to student achievement, I think I'd be wary of, again, mechanisms that incentivize districts to be bad actors. Again, not to say that they will, but if we create the incentive for districts to hold back students, they get additional funding for students that are low achieving, then they may not have as much of an incentive to increase funding or so to increase their performance above that threshold that deems them to be low achieving. And that's not just a kind of theoretical concern or something that's coming from, me being an economist. There's actually data on these types of phenomena that existed in the early days of No Child Left Behind. Districts would really target just those students at the margin. And you actually kind of see when initially No Child Left Behind put a lot of incentives for increasing performance at the proficiency threshold, you saw actually reduced performance of those at the tails that were far away, because schools reallocated their efforts towards those types of students that were more marginal to attract the additional dollars or to meet the incentives that were built in some of these states and municipalities. So now there's another question from Sacramento about declining enrollment and how that interacts with the LCFF formula. So this is an interesting one. So it doesn't, I guess, in general, so before kind of talking about its interaction with LCFF, declining enrollment actually increases the per pupil amount of funding that districts get because it acts on a lag. So a district has fewer students in each successive year, their enrollment is declining, but we give a 1 year hold harmless. So if you look at it in the data, you actually see that declining enrollment districts look like they're doing relatively better because they just have this 1 year lag. In per pupil terms, they have more money. Of course, that 1 year lag is there for a reason. It's a buffer. Districts can't necessarily downsize at the snap of a finger, and they don't see enrollment until they've already had to make hiring decisions. So in many ways, that higher level of funding that you see is something that's probably just more, it's not an artifact of the data, but it's not something that we expect to have a truly positive effect. Districts are downsizing, and that comes with painful decisions, potentially about reducing services or, the breadth of offerings, or even in some cases, closing schools. It doesn't have a clear interaction with the LCFF formula unless there's some sort of differential change in the types of students that are leaving or the demographic changes that are happening. And that certainly could be happening in some regions that are becoming, say, more or less affluent. That could kind of change the relative proportion of unduplicated pupils or the proportion that funds LCFF. So that's something to consider. I think more generally for me, when we're thinking about declining enrollment, it's something that is a fiscal pressure on districts that are declining. And so it's kind of something to consider when we think about, base levels of funding along with rising pension costs along with rising health and benefit costs and other kind of pressures districts are facing. Declining enrollment is just another one of those pressures. So in many ways, it's kind of distinct from these LCFF questions about how should we target funding or how much additional funding should we give to high need students. But rather, we're kind of in an era of demographic decline, at least among K-12 populations. From a state perspective, that might be a good thing in terms of the total amount of money that goes into the K-12 system. But for districts that are having to make these difficult decisions, that again can become an additional challenge. So the question from Rob from Children Now, just asking to say more about that 14-year estimate for the gap closure. If it's dollars driving the increases in spending, why is it that we need more dollars for supplemental concentration and not just more time? So, I mean, I guess the 14-year estimate was assuming that that kind of relative increase that we've seen isn't increasing over time. And so that is to say that the dollars or the kind of additional dollars that are allocated by the formula is staying constant. We actually know that that's not the case. The most recent budget increased this funding even more. And so that 14-year estimate might go down because the concentration, the increase in the concentration grant is actually even, it's even greater. And so there's even more funding going to high need students or high need districts. And so it's not necessarily that we need more dollars for those, if we want to improve these gaps faster, I think that would be a reason for more dollars. Or if we're kind of content with this pace, then that would be a reason to kind of sustain LCFF where it's at. But one reason that I mentioned, potentially more dollars for supplemental and concentration, or, a different slope for supplemental, as in higher supplemental, or a kind of earlier phase in of the concentration, is the fact that 14-year estimate is really about the highest need districts. So those districts that have very high shares of high need students. But it's not, LCFF's not particularly well targeted in terms of these large increases for districts that are kind of between 30 and 80% high need. It gives them a lot of additional funding, but the impacts that we were seeing when we estimated test score impacts were about, $1,000, $2,000 of additional funding, not about kind of $500 per student in additional funding. And so if we want to impact those students that are kind of more in the middle or more in the average California district, then that would be something that might require either a change in the supplemental or an earlier phase in for the concentration. Again, that would come at a significant cost. So that's the real trade-off there. So I have a question from Brian Guerrero from CTA. What about non-test score achievement, like reduced suspension or other measures? LCAPs have to work towards 8 state goals. I think this is a great question, and it's something I probably should have, if not caveated, at least explained more. In this report, we're looking just at kind of the most measurable and consistently measurable data points that we have going back a long period of time, like test scores and graduation and A through G completion. But again, districts are spending a lot of their LCFF dollars, and districts, in general, aren't just interested in improving test scores or graduation. There's a whole host of things that they're interested in improving, both, cognitive skills, both, kind of school climate, like suspension and other improvements at the school level, as well as kind of non-cognitive things that may not show up on a test score. And so anytime we look at test score effects, you can think of that as just one component of many improvements that could be happening. And in case, there's also examples in research where you don't always see improvements in test scores, but you see improvements in kind of later outcomes as well. And so I think, more research needs to be done, or there just needs to be more focus on, not just these test scores. This is one thing that we want, but it's one part of many, right? We also want to see these improvements in suspension rates. We want to see these improvements in other measures. We don't always have the best data about this. And so, holding districts or kind of being, just holding districts either accountable or being worried that we're not seeing, the most outstanding improvements along one dimension doesn't mean that things aren't working if districts aren't always targeting their funding to say, math and reading instruction in those grades that are actually tested. All right, so one more question from Joe Hong at Cal Matters. Is there any indication that LCFF has improved outcomes for students with disabilities, even though these students don't generate additional funding? That's a good question, and I think it's something I'll punt on a little bit because we didn't look specifically at these students, in part because we don't have good data, again, on test scores for students with disabilities. But it's an important question, given that they're not targeted, given, all we know just about kind of difficulties in financing, education for students with special needs. I think it's something that's worthy of more attention. So I don't want to kind of speculate. It's hard, I think that's something that's just harder to get at. It's also because, the total kind of sample size or numbers are smaller, and a lot of these kind of data exercises rely on having, sufficiently large number of students to really detect these improvements. So I have one more question. Based on these findings, how do you think the state should prioritize its future iterations on LCFF with the goal of bridging the opportunity gap? I think kind of in general, and I've mentioned this again, I think, improving funding has shown, has shown that it brings improvements on test scores. We know this not, just from the research that I've done here, from other research on LCFF by, say Rucker Johnson and Sean Tanner, by other research on school finance reforms like LCFF across the nation. So this is it's this kind of states that have improved their funding, particularly for kind of low income or high need students, have seen benefits for those students. So I think funding policies are a real way that we can improve outcomes and kind of bridge some of these gaps and opportunities. And that's not just in terms of test scores, but that's, in terms of, again, these kind of non-cognitive skills, graduation, college completion, and long run studies of these even find improvements from, just better funded schools in terms of adult earnings and, educational attainment. So I think there's a lot that we could do there if we want to invest more in our children in a financial sense. That's not to say that districts necessarily are always spending the right way. I think there's probably, there's often a retort to the types of suggestions that we should be spending more money, that districts may not be, spending this money appropriately. On average, the research suggests that that's not the case. There is kind of productive improvements. So I think it's just a mixed bag, right? Finance is not a silver bullet, but what do schools run on? Schools run on staff, schools run on buildings, schools run on materials. We know that there's staffing shortages, and it will take either higher salaries or other types of benefits to attract staff, especially in the labor market environments that we're in, especially given the high cost of living that we have in California. So the reality is that some of these additional investments, at least if we want to make them at the school level, will require additional funding if we want to kind of further improve the pace at which we're addressing these gaps, right? So it's not to say LCFF isn't working, that this additional funding kind of isn't doing things, but if we really want to get to that next level, it may require additional funding. Again, that's one part of the overall package, but it's an important part. And so I think we've reached the end here. I'll take one more question. Based on these findings, should the state have increased supplemental grants instead of concentration grants in this year's budget? That's a tough one. I guess I would still say the concentration grant is the right move. And one thing I didn't talk about this, and I'll kind of just say this quickly in a minute, there's a lot of reason to believe that. So the concentration grant is not just necessarily targeting more funding to, say, a certain set of high need students, but not all high need students are the same level of need, for example, right? So districts with very concentrated poverty, I think, are ones that we may want to target more. So I would think, increasing the supplemental grant is an option. I would actually say, instead of increasing the slope of the concentration grant, having it phase in earlier might be a better way to do that. I think, the kind of increasing the supplemental grant would really be, a lot of additional funding for some of the lower need districts in the state, whereas kind of increasing the phase in of concentration grant funding would really mean a lot of additional funding at kind of those middle districts that have, majority high need, but not quite super high concentrations. All right, so that's the end of the program. And so thanks for all those who stuck around. Again, I'd like to thank our funders, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. If you pre-registered for this event, later today, you'll receive a survey. So we hope that you take a couple of minutes to respond and let us know how you did, or how we did. And please be safe and have a great afternoon. Thank you.